Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. I want to begin by greeting you all with the Islamic greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me first begin by saying Jazakallah khairan to the organizers of this event for deeming me worthy for the replacement speakers. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept their efforts and make it weigh heavy on their scales. Today's event, entitled Imperialism and the Axis of Resistance, is a very important one, especially in light of the ongoing genocide in Gaza that we have seen and how it fits into a wider global agenda. Now, just to set the scene before we resume with today's function, in the last 100 and 120 years, mankind has seen and witnessed change on an exponential level, like no other time in human history. We have seen material and worldly advancement in terms of technology, modern warfare, now AI, information, communication, the internet, you name it. We have also seen in the last 100 years, as well as where we've seen progress, we've seen regress. We've seen major cultural regression. We've seen how, at least from an Islamic perspective, values and lifestyles and behaviors which are unequivocally antithetical to godliness has now become normalized. A lot's been happening 100 years. And this has taken place in a post-Islamicate world, at a time where a fifth of population of the world do not have a spiritual or political reference point or a guide, like we had done for good, bad, and ugly for the best part of a millennia. It's not long now. The Muslim majority world, who are not the only victims of imperialism, there are the vast majority of the global south, outside of the Western Hemisphere, have experienced, and continue to experience, the adverse implications of imperialism. But looking at the Muslim world specifically, we are in a state of 50 plus secular nation states. Some claim to be republics, others claim to be monarchies, others claim to be democracies. But the sad reality is, from Morocco to Indonesia and to as north as the Caucasus to as south as Tanzania, the state of the Muslim world is a dire one when you look at it from a political perspective. And it is in light of this reality that I open today's discussion. The initial function was supposed to be speeches given by respective speakers, but today's discussion, it will be more like a podcast. Can I see a show of hands of people who watch or listen to podcasts? Keep your hands up if you watch the Blood Brothers podcast. Easy, that's good, alhamdulillah. So that's going to be the format of today's discussion. It's going to be a conversation between me and the esteemed Shaykh Asrar Rashid, who needs no introduction, who has joined us from Birmingham. And without any further delay, I want to give salam to the Shaykh. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Shaykh, let's set the scene by establishing definitions. What is imperialism?
So if we even check a basic definition of imperialism, it's any country or nation imposing its way of economic rules or military imposition, placing military forces within a different country or nation, an independent nation, but no longer independent because of that imposition of economic rules or, in some cases, invasions, outright invasions, or undermining other countries. That generally and broadly speaking is known as imperialism. Something that has always happened in ancient times, but has developed, as you mentioned, the development of imperialism over time has increased. Just the simple invention of soap affected humanity to the point that it killed off bacteria and germs, and that now we have a population explosion. If that's the case with soap, you can imagine the effect of other technology and development of technology, which those who have technology in their hands can superimpose whatever power that brings about, superimpose that on other populations. So, for instance, taking Israel as an example, that illegal entity can superimpose itself upon the Palestinians with superior technology, of course, which is supplied by the United States of America. That is a modern-day example of imperialism, but an extreme example of imperialism. Of course, you will have more subtle forms of imperialism in the form of the IMF, the World Bank, and other institutions that were left behind by imperialists of another age.
Who or what do you understand to be the axis of resistance? Keeping in mind that there are laws in place in this country with regards to how we talk about certain organizations, of course, and that should be made clear to everyone here. But some of the state actors, actually primarily non-state actors that we're going to discuss, are prescribed terrorist organizations. So just for the sake of disclaimers and legality, the conversation that we're going to have is an entirely an educational one and an academic one. Who do you understand, or what do you understand to be axis of resistance?
Because of your long disclaimer,
Yeah.
I would want to say we have people in this hall who are a part of the axis of resistance. I would say Banksy the artist is a part of the axis of resistance. So my definition of the axis of resistance is broad. You have Dilly Hussain, a part of the axis of resistance. 5 Pillars, a part of the axis of resistance. You have other individuals, prominent individuals, Kareem, our brother Kareem, known as Loki, definitely a part of the axis of resistance. So these are some British personalities, and more lately Julian Assange, a part of the axis of resistance. So it's a broad term, and to limit it to specific militias or to limit it to certain nation states is narrowing the definition of axis of resistance. Any resistance towards imperialism, any resistance towards violations of human rights, violations of what we refer to as huquq al-ibad, is termed as the axis of resistance, even though the term is now being politicized. I would say the axis of resistance is a broad term, inclusive of a broad range of people, not just Muslims. As you mentioned, there are activists within South America who oppose American foreign policy within South America. There are activists across the world that will oppose any nation state persecuting peoples of various cultures and backgrounds.
For the sake of today's conversation, at least at the beginning part, can we at least agree between ourselves what is conventionally understood and defined as the axis of resistance? So let me just present that to you. It would be all the different players: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas. Those would generally be defined as the axis of resistance. When you coin that term today, that's who it's referring to. For the sake of this conversation,
that would be the corporate media definition.
Okay.
So I would say that's the Rupert Murdoch definition of the axis of resistance. That's to vilify the term itself, because then you are associated with any crimes that North Korea may do, any crimes that Putin may do, any crimes that China may do. That is associated with anyone who may be a part of the broader axis of resistance. So there may be some policies of certain groups or nations that are positive, but at the same time that very same group may violate human rights. So to be a part of this corporate media definition of the axis of resistance, I would say we are not a part of that particular definition.
but they themselves define themselves as the axis of resistance. Abu Ubaidah, Nasrallah, the leadership in Iran, they refer to themselves as the axis of resistance.
Well, with Abu Ubaidah specifically, if someone listens to Abu Ubaidah's speeches, they would realize that Abu Ubaidah makes it very clear that their resistance to the Israeli entity is limited to Palestine, meaning Abu Ubaidah does not interfere with regard to policies of other nations. He doesn't comment on, for instance, Bashar al-Assad, what Bashar al-Assad may do in Syria, or Abu Ubaidah will not comment on what occurs in China or what occurs in other nations. So Abu Ubaidah specifically, he would not fall into that definition of an axis of resistance in terms of interfering in other countries. But if you mean the alliance between Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and that specific resistance to the Israeli occupation, then that again limits the definition of the axis of resistance, because Russia and China have no role in that, at least explicitly.
Now, we'll touch upon some of these players later on in the conversation, but let's just continue from where we both began, and that is imperialism. The world that we live in today, post-World War II, was a very different world. It's known as the five policemen of the world, right? The victors of World War II, those who defeated the Nazi, the Japanese Empire, and so forth. That would be the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, right? We saw the Cold War, best part of 45 years, and Pax Americana emerge in the world. And ultimately, whether it's the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, NATO, all these key international bodies and institutions which holds the entire existing global order together, is primarily American/Western, right? So given that reality, can Russia and China be described as imperialist for their foreign policy? For example, Russia's activities in Georgia or Ukraine or in the Caucasus, or China's economic imperialism, how it has, quite frankly, got many Muslim-majority nations gripped by economic loans, promises of infrastructure. Would you regard these as types of imperialism?
What I would say with regard to that, these nation states have a structuralist system that post-French Revolution, you've had Napoleonic, after his invasion of Egypt in 1798, in order to underline Britain's passage to India, you had a colonization of these regions from France, including France and Britain, but also Russia. And you had the imposition of a structuralist system, getting rid of what was there before. In our case, it was the Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate. And also, if you look at 18 of the world's great civilizations, over 9 of them, more than half, were destroyed by Western imperialism and colonization. This includes Russia, not China as much. But the system, the state system, the system of governance, the effects of which we observe in France today. For instance, when France modified its constitution to place in abortion as being a right, meaning what we would refer to as child killing, an abortion of the aborting of a child, a living child in the womb of a woman, as being a human right. That system has been superimposed in all these world nations. And that entails that, including China, so you had the wiping away of the old Chinese traditions. After Mao, you've had an imposition of communism, but today it would be really some type of binary system of capitalism and communism, and that is being superimposed on the people also. So we, as Muslims, would observe this system, which is superimposed even in Russia and China, as being tyrannical. Similarly, in Russia, you've had the shift. So post-communism, we've had a shift from communism to more of a capitalist system. That system is antithetical to Islam. And that would entail for us that there is imperialism, whether it be from China, America, the United States, or Europe, or Russia. However, when these nations have their own interlockings and their struggles amongst themselves, so you have Russia fighting America and America fighting Russia, there are definitely narratives that are pushed out from both, and there are Muslims who align themselves with Russia, and there are Muslims who align themselves with the United States of America. What people like myself call for is more of an autonomous...
Do you align with any of those entities?
No, never, no.
Russia?
No, not with no one. Meaning, we have our own civilization, we have our own way, which is Islam. But of course, in some cases, the United States may have a policy that we agree with. And in some cases, Russia may have a policy that we agree with. So when you see a Muslim align himself with a certain policy, it doesn't entail supporting an entire government or a particular world leader. So there are things even a crazy man like Donald Trump will say that we as Muslims would agree with, like his opposition to abortion, for instance. But it doesn't entail that we support Donald Trump or we support the American way of life being imported into other nations, which is the very definition of imperialism.
Do you believe that pre-modern Muslim polities or Islamic polities have engaged in imperialism? Because I always fear that, and I've experienced this myself, is Muslims are very good at criticizing about how our lands were colonized, but people argue back by saying, well, how do you expect Islam spread from North Africa all the way to Far East Asia? How do you think Arabic spoken in so many countries? There was also Islamic imperialism, Islamic colonialism. Do you think that's a fair argument?
There may be specific examples in Muslim history. Of course, to believe that Islamic civilization was a total utopia would be naivety. But, for instance, the Ottoman Turks, they ruled the vast majority of the Middle East, Arabic-speaking nations. Those Arabic-speaking nations still speak Arabic. They speak more French than they speak Turkish. Yes? So they speak more French than they speak Turkish. Similarly, Syria was the heartland of the Islamic Caliphate. Yet you have a sizable number of Christians, other religions also, sizable number. A good 10 to 20% of the country is still Christian, Syria. Similarly in Egypt. So there was no imposition of a different religion upon the people. Similarly, Hinduism in India. Why is there a sizable number of Muslims in India? Because of the Sufi preachers. When they entered, the Muslims of India adopted Islam due to Sufi preachers, not because of the rulers. The rulers did not enforce the religion upon the people of those nations. So this is, of course, a very deep topic to go into. But I would say today, when you have groups like ISIS superimposing Islam upon people, people view that as Islamic history, which is, of course, antithetical to our history.
Just a quick comment. I don't want to kind of focus on this because you're right, it is a subject in and of itself to discuss separately. But look, we can't take away from Islamic history that when there was jihad for the sake of Allah, the three offers were, you accept Islam, you pay jizya, or it's war. That can very easily be interpreted as an imperialistic threat. What's your thoughts on that?
So the jizya, what was the jizya? Firstly, the war was only waged against people who were warmongers themselves. So the purpose of the jihad was the offensive jihad was to counter the nature within those peoples to wage war. So, for instance, African tribals, there are deep parts of Black Africa which Islam entered, but the tribal cultures were not they were not torn apart. They were not fragmented away by the Muslims. The Muslims didn't do away with those tribal cultures. But when they entered urban areas where people were warmongering, like the Byzantine Empire, they gave those three conditions. And then with the jizya itself, the jizya is very misunderstood. The jizya was less in some cases than the zakat, which is taken from Muslims. It was a very basic tax. It wasn't something heavy. It was never a burdensome tax. That only changed in the Ottoman Caliphate toward the early 1830s because of the Tanzimat movement. Because of the Tanzimat movement, which was Western influence, because the Ottomans had taken loans from Western bankers, and then in order to pay back those loans, they were advised to impose heavy taxes upon the Christians of Europe. And that led to problems with the Armenians. It led to problems with the Christians in Eastern Europe. Those problems, the effects of which we still observe today, it wasn't due to Islamic polity or Islamic policy towards those religious groups.
How is the defensive that you just made of Islamic civilization any different to that of Western scholars and academic and Orientalist thinkers who say, well, fine, we accept that colonialism was quite bad and bloody, but we gave you train tracks, we gave you medicine, we gave you modernity, we gave you technology, we gave you civility, we gave you infrastructure, all of which you benefit from today.
In reality, if you look at when they entered Bengal,
That's when the British, where they first landed.
they went into Bengal first.
They did it.
Bengal had a higher literacy than London. There were more books printed in Bengal than in London at the same time. So when they left, they did leave trains, but what were those trains utilized for? They were utilized to transport British arms or British goods, for cotton, for instance, cotton which was grown in India and then sent to Britain, so the factories here in Blackburn and Preston and other areas, they can make cheap fabric to sell to the world, while Indian economy, or what we refer to as Hind, the Hind economy was undermined, which under Aurangzeb was 26% of the world's GDP. So the reality of those train lines being made was only for the benefits of the British at the time. Similarly, the Bengal famine, there was more than one Bengal famine. There was a famine in the time of Churchill also. And then not any different to Starmer, the comment Starmer made recently. What has changed within British policy? If you have the light Zionist like Starmer, and then you have an imperialist like Churchill, and then prior to that, the policies within India at that time. Why I mention India specifically, or Hind, is because Hind was the jewel in the crown.
Of course.
And it at the same time, they made the people of Hind grow opium. So the opium fields in Afghanistan today, now they've cut down because of the Taliban.
Yes.
But the opium fields have a big history. That opium then was exported to China, causing the opium wars. So these arguments really, they are a cop-out when you look at them in detail. Yes, you do have history of some Muslim rulers who did carry out, but it's a long history of 1400 years. Within that 1400 years, the policies of the Muslims within the places that they conquered were not the same as, for instance, British India.
Okay. Do you think World Bank and IMF loans are good for Muslim nations?
Of course not. What is beneficial to an economy is being self-sufficient. In terms of, if Pakistan defaulted on its loans today, the most beneficial thing for Pakistan to have is having its own water supply, where it does not need to rely on India, for instance, to have water coming down from the ice caps of Kashmir. And similarly, it's having a self-sufficient farming system where they do not need to import goods from other countries to be self-sufficient. So even if they default on a loan, they will not starve to death, as what happens in many countries, because once the IMF loan reaches a country and the country takes that loan, there is the obvious evil of riba involved, usually, and then the heavy taxation, the taxation that comes along with the riba, then taxes like VAT, which now people are complaining that in Saudi Arabia the prices have gone up. Why? Because they have the likes of Tony Blair advising them. Tony Blair is advising Saudi Arabia on its economy, the peace envoy to the Middle East. And simple things like a cup of tea have gone up in Saudi Arabia. Prior to that, Saudi Arabia never had high prices. Anyone who went to Hajj and Umrah, they will know that Saudi Arabia, the prices were relatively cheap in comparison to the West. But ever since Tony Blair has been advising the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the prices have gone up. Why all these heavy taxations? In order to pay off IMF loans. The main thing Muslims need to concentrate on is self-sufficiency. Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu, he said, any nation that cannot feed itself and cannot clothe itself is a failed nation. So that entails that we must be self-sufficient in those basic needs.
There are 50 plus, let's say 51 Muslim majority nations. The vast majority, overwhelming majority, I'm talking 45, yeah, they do have IMF loans, they do have World Bank loans, they do, some have US military bases. There is some tangling of being in the pockets of greater powers. Do you think there are any free Muslim nations today?
Yes, Afghanistan is very free. They are debt-free, and they actually govern according, for the majority, Hanafi fiqh. And so they have that autonomy, Afghanistan. There is a free nation of the world that many people fail to mention, and that free nation is known as Palestine. When I went to occupied Palestine many years ago, when I came back, I wrote a post. I said, the world, and that was before Afghanistan was free. I said, now I know why there is, this wasn't my exact wording, but why there is so much antagonism towards Palestine. Because the whole world is imprisoned by Zionism except Palestine. And people didn't understand, how can you say Palestine is free? Palestine is free because they are not under the world system. They are attempting to do that with what is happening now, but Palestine is the most free nation in the world. So I would say these two nations are free, Palestine, Afghanistan. These two are free nations.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about Afghanistan. They're in a very difficult situation. Initially, there was the $9 billion that was frozen by America, more than half of which was given to the victims, allegedly given to the victims of 9/11, even though there wasn't a single Afghan on any of the planes. Famine, austerity, hunger, the situation's quite bad. But on the flip side, you've seen opium intake pretty much die out. Opium fields are being burned. Drug use has minimized significantly. Corruption, bribery, robbery. But they're still in a very difficult situation where in the absence of international recognition, it is hard to survive and trade as a nation. What would your words of advice be to the leadership of one of the free nations where you've just identified in how they should now move forward? Because Afghanistan liberated itself. It is free, much freer than many Muslim majority nations, but they're in that situation now where it's difficult to trade with the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. It's difficult for money to move in and out without compromising on certain moral issues, to access certain funding, to access certain trade deals. What do you do in that situation? What do you do in a situation where a Muslim nation has freed itself, has liberated itself, but is in an international order which requires it to subdue itself, submit and conform to?
Well, I would say a nation like Afghanistan, which has resilience, 40 years of resistance from 1979 until now, that nation that has survived 40 years of difficulty and hardship, invasions and war, they will replenish themselves and they will revive themselves economically also. But it will take a number of years. Of course, they would need to have a board of economists. And when I use the word economist, this term is so loaded because generally people think of the London School of Economics when you say the word economists. But economists, what I mean by economists is people who are experienced in the field. They must set up a Majlis Shura, a board of consultation that can give them the best advice in terms of with regard to trade. But they do have some good ties with the UAE, with Qatar, yes, with other rich nation states that they can trade with
for now.
And they can increase a broader base for themselves in Africa, in neutral nations. So even the West Indies, for instance, even though West Indies, the economy is not so great, but an example of nations which have some type of affection towards Muslims or towards Afghanistan. That is one of the ways. But what I mentioned, the main thing for Afghanistan is self-sufficiency. Do they have the self-sufficiency to feed their people and clothe their people? Because one thing with Islamic rule, It does not entail having what we had in the Industrial Revolution was products. We have products. So whenever we want products, we can have bottled water, we can have cameras, we have all these products. Does it mean to be a successful nation that we can have all the products we want, Calvin Klein and everything else? How do we measure success? Is it through basic food and clothing, or is it through having all these various products? So if you mean economic failings in terms of having products and different types of utilities, then perhaps it's better having your freedom than being imprisoned through the industrial world, or having your basics rather than being sold to a commercial world that when you see billboards, for instance, meaning should Afghanistan be covered with billboards advertising different corporations, or should it just have those basics? These are hard decisions to make for any nation.
Now, you were supposed to have initially shared a platform with the leader of the Workers' Party today, George Galloway, who's not here. But I'm going to posit to you that he has very specific positions. I think it would be wrong and unjust to say that George Galloway has been very firm and consistent on the cause of Palestine. You can't take that away from him. And in other noble anti-racism, anti-war positions. But he has very specific positions on Syria, on Russia, on China, the Uyghurs. What are your personal positions on these given areas? So let's talk about Syria and Assad. You've spoken about this very recently. I'm asking you this because given the title of today's event, there's been many eyes and ears attentively watching this conversation. And it's a question that's repeatedly asked of you. I appreciate that. I know that. Do you think that Arab Spring, generally, let's start with Arab Spring, we'll get to Syria. Do you think that Arab Spring was a genuine, sincere attempt by the Ummah to free itself of imperialism?
So, what is termed as the Arab Spring started in Tunisia with the unfortunate incident of a man burning himself. Now, there is clear resentment in the Middle East towards the dictatorships that run and govern those countries. I lived in Syria, and the people despised Assad, the majority of the people. The reason why the Nusayris, who are known as the Alawis, why they aligned themselves with Bashar al-Assad, why the Druze aligned themselves with Bashar al-Assad, why the Christians aligned themselves with Bashar al-Assad, and a huge proportion of Sunnis did align themselves with Bashar al-Assad, is because they feared the alternative.
What's the alternative?
They feared an alternative that, and this was the propaganda of the regime, that the only alternative would be a majority Sunni Ikhwan al-Muslimin government that will slaughter the minorities, which is rubbish. It's not true.
That is rubbish.
Yes, that is rubbish, because the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, no matter what they say regarding them, and even the FSA in its initial stages, they were sincere people involved in the FSA. There was one video, for instance, where a man named Abu Muhammad, a Sunni, he is talking to an old Alawi old man. And he says to the Alawi old man, tell me the truth, what would the people from your group do to me if they were in charge? And the old man, he responds by saying, everyone is kullukum makhluq Allah. All of you are creation of Allah. But he treats the old man very nice. That was the general attitude in Syria amongst the Sunni Muslims, because of the Sufi nature of the people. That meaning that the country, for the majority, the Sunnis were Sufi, and they had a very soft nature towards everyone. But the regime, they portrayed the Ikhwan al-Muslimin because of the events in Hama
In 1982.
In 1982, but remember the Ikhwan al-Muslimin
of the people, what happened in 1982?
So prior to 1982, the cadets, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin did kill cadets from the regime soldiers. They carried out attacks and killed soldiers from the regime, which led in turn to major rifts within Syrian society. Post 1971, when Hafizullah Assad he became president of Syria, the Ba'athist regime always portrayed itself as a secular regime, non-sectarian. That may have been true ostensibly, but when you enter the depths of the Syrian regime, they were actually sectarian in terms of treating Sunnis who had an opposing political view as political opponents that they would easily arrest and detain and torture. That was well known. They would torture people, political opponents, and then this led to the events in the late 70s when the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, they retaliated. And then in Hama, the estimates of the number of people that were killed differ. Some people say 10,000, some say 15,000, some say 30,000. But thousands of people were slaughtered in Hama. And let me tell you something, in the early 2000s, when you would live in Syria, the Syrian people would not even mention 1982 out of fear of the secret police, the mukhabarat. The mukhabarat would torture people, and they would detain people as well, even Westerners. They would detain them, and this was not only in Syria. You had this in Egypt, in Tunisia, throughout the Middle East. As I was mentioning you earlier, you asked with regard to the axis of resistance. Gamal Abdel Nasser was viewed as the axis of resistance in his time.
So was Gaddafi, so was Saddam, so was Assad.
So Gamal Abdel Nasser, he beat off the Israeli, French and British invasion of the Suez Canal.
But then got smashed in 6 days in 1967.
And then in 1967, he failed in his attempt to beat Israel.
Do you think that was a conspiracy? Do you think there was some plotting and planning for that type of colossal defeat to happen in 6 days? Because, for example, in 1973, we know for very sure they were held back.
Anwar Sadat. Well, I do not believe there was a conspiracy. I believe the Arabs did not fight with heart.
In 67?
In 67, because Arab nationalism... Now, I'm going to contradict people like Noam Chomsky. People like Noam Chomsky, they tend to push for Arab nationalism, saying nationalism is what actually... democratic nationalism is what is needed in the Middle East. That's someone commenting without understanding the psyche of majority of the Muslim world. The majority, except those who have been educated through Western-style education, they are the exceptions. But generally speaking, Muslims who resist globalization, imperialism, who come from a spiritual Islamic framework, they have more heart and more courage than people who come from Arab nationalism or any type of nationalism. So the Arab nationalism failed. It failed due to those reasons. But there is also a clear exploitation of Islamic groups as well. So you have, for instance, a British exploitation of various Islamic groups. There's a long history of that. And it happens today also. There is an exploitation that undermines Islamic resistance. So because of the failings of so many Islamic movements and the exploitation of so many Islamic movements, many analysts will not see Islam as an alternative to, for instance, nationalist democratic movements within the Middle East. But all those movements have failed.
But the Palestinian resistance is mostly Islamically inclined. The days of Palestinian nationalism, socialism, I think that's declined. I think most resistance groups, the proscribed ones and the not, are Islamically inclined.
Well, the Palestinian resistance movement has only ever been successful once it aligned itself with Islam. Otherwise, it's a failure. From the Yasser Arafat's discussions in 93, the Oslo Accords were a failure. Post 93, the Palestinians lost from 93 to 2000 to the second Intifada, they lost over 40,000 acres of land. So Bill Clinton, with his so-called peace deal, the illegal Israeli settlements were still taking land, and over 40,000 acres of land was lost in that time. So nationalism has always been a failure for the Arabs. But Gamal Abdel Nasser, when
nationalism, hold on.
Depending on the nature of the nationalism, the nature of
Which type of? I'm sorry. I know it's a bit of a digression. I do this whenever we speak, even off camera. What type of nationalism could be haram?
A jingoist, racist nationalism would be haram. Yeah, so a jingoist, racist nationalism would be haram.
What type of
A divisive nationalism would be haram. Divisive.
Okay.
That divides the Muslims, divides the Ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But as I was mentioning, Gamal Abdul Nasir, he was observed as being a part of the axis of resistance. But later when Anwar Sadat was killed, he was killed by people belonging to so-called what they refer to as
Islamic Jihad at the time.
Islamic Jihad. And who was a part of the Islamic Jihad? Ayman al-Zawahiri. Zawahiri, who died recently, the leader of Al-Qaeda, the successor to Osama bin Laden. He was the leader of what became the face of so-called Islamist groups. So when people see Islam in action, they envisage these type of groups as being the representatives of Al-Islam. But the reality is Al-Islam is the only alternative for the Arab people. And as you mentioned, why were those invasions, why were they a failure in 1967? Was because they fought with that heart and courage. And why did they fight with that heart and courage? Because they were not similar to the Afghanis. When the Afghanis fought the Soviet Union, and this again changes the definition of axis of resistance, because the Afghani jihad was funded by the CIA, the ISI.
That wasn't a secret.
It wasn't a secret, it wasn't a conspiracy.
Yeah.
But the Afghani fighters, the vast majority of them, specifically what became known as the Taliban, Mullah Umar, the likes of Mullah Zaif, these fighters, they fought for Islam. They did not fight for the supremacy of America. They did not fight for the supremacy of anything else. And they were successful in defeating communist Russia. They were successful in that. But while the wars in 1967 and 1973, they were not fought with that front.
I want to wrap up on the Arab Spring. And I know that's not fair because Arab Spring is such a vast topic, right? But time is of the essence and we don't have much of it. Ben Ali fell in Tunisia. Gaddafi came to an end in Libya.
With NATO support.
Abdullah Saleh did a run-out from Yemen to Saudi. Heinz uprisings were quelled violently with the help of Saudi and the GCC. We saw what happened in Egypt. Mubarak fell. Morsi, rahimahullah, Dr. Morsi, Allah mercy on him. He came overthrown in a year in a coup d'etat that was backed by America, funded by the UAE and Saudi. So I just want to get your general thoughts and concluding thoughts on the Arab Spring. Do you think this was a sincere movement that was hijacked and manipulated, or was it a manipulation from the very beginning?
There is a sincere movement for people wanting to rid themselves of dictators. There's no doubt in that. As I mentioned, if anyone who has lived in the Middle East will know that the people despise them, for the most part, they despise their rulers because of the oppression. But it was hijacked. As you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, they supported rebels where it suited them, like in Syria, but they supported dictators where it suited them, like in Yemen. So there was a big game at play. Likewise with Morsi, who was not only a political prisoner post Abdel Fattah Sisi taking power, he imprisoned him, and they at one point when they took the Quran away from him.
Yes.
And they didn't give him even in Guantanamo Bay, the detainees are given Qurans. Even in Guantanamo Bay, they are given Qurans, even though there are American soldiers who disrespect the Quran in order to enrage the prisoners. But someone like Abdel Fattah Sisi, this is a former elected president of a country. You take his basic freedoms, his basic rights, and then he dies in prison, and you do not even permit a funeral. They do not even permit a funeral. So this is where the naivety of those who think that the backers of the Arab Spring are sincere. That the backers of the Arab Spring, which should be termed as the Arab Winter, are not sincere. Erdogan is never sincere with the Arabs. So he may have backed the Syrian FSA, He may have he permitted thousands of young men to go into Syria and join the ranks of ISIS, permitting them from border control. At one point when they placed blockages on the border, then there was smuggling of people going through, hundreds of people from Europe. At one point you support those rebel groups, but on the other hand, in Libya, you support the NATO invasion, meaning you support the same people. The invasion of Libya happened in 2011 under the David Cameron government. What happened? False news, fake news about Gaddafi, and also that he wanted to carry out the genocide in Benghazi, when in reality Gaddafi had given safe passage to the rebel fighters through Egypt. So they back the toppling of Gaddafi in NATO. This is Erdogan also included. I mean, he backed that toppling of Gaddafi, backing the toppling of...
But the Libyans wanted that. The Libyans who were opposed to Gaddafi wanted intervention. Many Syrians who opposed Assad wanted intervention. When you're at the brink of a regime where it's going to basically quell your uprising or revolution or your call for rights and freedoms...
When I saw Bernard Levy, the Jewish philosopher, French philosopher, backing the toppling of Gaddafi, he backs the toppling of Bashar, he backs the son of Masood in the Panjshir Valley. What's his name, the son of Masood? Yes, the warlord Masood, who died a few days before 9/11. This Bernard Levy backs Bangladesh rhetoric against Pakistan. Wherever there is division, you find this Jewish Zionist Bernard Levy, French philosopher, turning up, tweeting, meaning they back this divisive type of politics. Not to say, and let me make this clear. For instance, I am against the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the toppling of Saddam Hussein. There are some emotive people who will then say, therefore, meaning they've not studied logic, basic logic. They understand from that, this is mafhum mukhalafa, they understand, therefore you back Saddam in terms of his war with Iran, in terms of his gassing of the Kurds, you back Saddam Hussein imprisoning so many people. The answer is no. I am against the invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam Hussein because of what the after effects and the alternative is. There is no better alternative. Similarly, I oppose the invasion of Libya and the toppling of Gaddafi because the alternative is no better.
So how do the people of the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim world, who are under brutal dictatorships and regimes, one-party system, whether you're talking about Pakistan, Bangladesh, where the Awami League pre-us as a one-party state. In Pakistan, we saw what happened with Imran Khan. And we see different versions and variations of this across the breadth of the Muslim world. What then does the Awam Ummah do?
Meaning, what is the alternative to a Zionist-backed invasion?
Why?
The example of these NATO invasions. I mean, that's how I would word the question. What is the alternative to a Zionist-backed invasion? Zionist in the broad terms, in terms of NATO being Zionist as well. I would say a grassroots revolution like what occurred in Afghanistan. Why is Afghanistan free today? Afghanistan, the movement, the Taliban movement, is an actual grassroots movement. People say it's ISA-backed. It's not actually ISA-backed. It's not an ISI operation. That's a propaganda. The ISI despised the leadership of Taliban. They had Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif arrested and sent to Guantanamo Bay. They gave him up. The ISI, as Abdul Salam Zaif mentions, they have two tongues and two faces. So until there is a real grassroots movement that does not have a Zionist finger, a Zionist hand, or any other hand, external hand, you cannot have an Islamic uprising backed by Putin. You cannot have an Islamic uprising backed by China. You cannot have, backed in the sense that once they have achieved their goals, they leave the country in turmoil. Like Syria today. Where is the FSA today? There is no FSA. Where are all those rebel groups? At one point there were 1,500 rebel groups functioning in Syria.
Russian bombs and Syrian bombs that decimated Syria. The rebels didn't have airplanes and fighter jets.
But again, stating that criticism with regard to the rebel groups does not mean that I say that I am supporting Russian imperialism in the country. Bashar al-Assad was aligned with Russia, and therefore Russia came to his aid. But if the alternative is causing more bloodshed, I would say rather than going to that alternative, the status quo is always better than more bloodshed. How much more bloodshed do we need? In the current war in Syria, how many people have died? Over 1 million. How many are internally displaced? Over 8 million. How many have left the country? Over 3 million. In Afghanistan, we look at the statistics of the number of dead. These are real lives and real people on the ground. If you have a status quo, which is a less of an evil, it's better to stick to the status quo than going to that which will cause more bloodshed, more chaos, and more disunity within the Ummah.
So there's been times in Islamic history where emerging dynasties that we champion and praise today, they arose from a situation where there were competing superpowers, whether it was the Mongols, whether it was the Byzantines, whether it was the Crusaders. There's been many times where emerging Muslim powers and dynasties in their formative years had to sometimes do siyasat, and sometimes had to compromise, sometimes had to side in the wars of competing powers. And that's how they emerged. Why can there not be a pragmatic approach in terms of, even though there's not actually a proven success story of it in the modern time, but why can it not be the case that a Muslim revival or a resistance, a global resistance emerges in the reality of a competing superpowers, where Pax Americana is receding? In fact, the rise of China may actually help the Muslim world, that in fact, the Muslim Ummah's revival, which is not an issue of if, it's merely an issue of when. Do we agree on that, Shah?
Yes.
So why can it not happen at a time where we may need to take a side of one of the superpowers against the others, or position ourselves and play siyasat and be pragmatic? Why can it not be then to overthrow a tyrant? You may, at least in the short term, require the help of an external power. Why can it not be like that? Like, for example, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi.
Are you applying that on the alliance of, for instance, Syrian rebels with NATO?
I'm talking generally.
In general terms, if it violates our own autonomy, which it does in the current scenario, and it leads to more bloodshed, because what has changed from those times until now? In those times, armies would meet on the battlefield.
They would.
Today, entire cities are demolished. So what Assad did with barrel bombs in Halab, similarly the Russian planes in Raqqa, it led to killing of civilians, and the opposite also. So when the NATO planes, they bombed different parts of Syria, killed thousands of civilians. So comparing the current situation with the ancient times or medieval times is totally different, because in those times the armies would meet on the battlefield, a leader may align himself with other peoples, but there was no discriminant killings, with the odd exceptions like the Mongol invasion or the Crusader invasion, where they killed the civilians also. But generally speaking, the number of deaths were not like the way people are dying in Gaza today. So the pragmatism today would be to, as Bruce Lee said, the art of war is what fighting without fighting, is to avoid bloodshed as much as possible. That is the best solution for the Muslims today. As much as possible, avoid bloodshed, diplomacy as much as possible. And only go for revolution when, and this is based on Islamic principles, when it is near absolute certainty that you will actually topple that regime. Otherwise,
you're not anti-revolution. And there is a perception that you are.
We all have some Che Guevara in us, in the sense that he's an atheist, but in the sense that the revolution should only happen when there is absolute near certainty that you will actually topple the regime. Otherwise, it should be avoided. Even a Sheikh Bouti, so people don't quote him properly, he said to the rebels, name me your leader. Name me your leader. Who is the leader that is leading you? And I will join you. There's videos of him saying this. Because he knew that they are leaderless. And that is exactly what happened. First you had Jabhatul Nusra, and then you had 1,500 factions. And then later on, the ISI, not the Pakistani ISI, the Iraqi state, the so-called Islamic State in Iraq, it becomes ISIS and emerges. So he was correct that they were leaderless. They could not even appoint one emir for the entire revolution. So where are the leaders of these revolutions?
If I just may comment just briefly on the Syrian rebels, I don't want to stick on Syria too much. But look, I think it would be fair to say that initially there were movements and groups, there were defections from the Syrian Arab army, right? And there were different players that had vested interest in Syria. You had Saudi Arabia supporting Jaish al-Islam, you had Qatar supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, you had Turkey supporting the Free Syrian Army, you had the Americans supporting the Kurdish groups. Everyone had vested interest, and they were flooding the rebel groups with money and weapons when it suited them. When the call came from Washington or from Paris that money and funds had to stop, Saudi and Qatar obliged. So would it not be fair to say again, because look, to say that Jabhat al-Nusra, and remember again, we're talking from an educational point of view, it shouldn't be taken as anything else. They had Syrians within their organization. Jaish al-Islam had Syrians within their organization. Liwal al-Tawheed, Sukur al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, Ahrar al-Sham, all these different groups had sons of Syria within them. When there were non-Syrian fighters that had come from other parts, there is so much evidence that they were actually welcomed by many Syrians. They married many Syrian women. So are we then saying, again, I'm asking you this, was it a plot from the beginning? I'm asking specifically Syria now. Do you believe it was a plot from the very beginning? Or was this a sincere movement that began from the death of 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib? May Allah have mercy on him.
The events of Douma, the protests in Damascus, these were all grassroots protests. They were not, there was no conspiracy. I've mentioned that very clearly because anyone who has first-hand contact with people in Syria on the ground, they will know this. And I'm talking pre-revolution. For instance, there's a teacher of mine. He would keep anti-Hafizul Asad poetry. He was a poet. And he would write down the poetry and keep that poetry in a book hidden away. Sometimes he would read that poetry to me. But he's anti-revolution. Why is he anti-revolution?
Anti-Assad and anti-revolution.
Yes. Okay. And that is the position of the majority of the Shia who stayed in Syria. They stayed in Syria for a reason. They are anti-Assad, they are anti-revolution because they know the result of the revolution would be failure. And that is what it is. The Shia who are in denial regarding this, they are in denial. Some of them, I mentioned this, they criticize Sheikh al-Bouti, but they themselves were actually funded to live in posh hotels and go to expensive dinners, while the Shia who stayed in Syria, they actually suffered, even though they were not pro-regime. They were anti-revolution because they saw the problems with the revolution and the bloodshed, real homelessness, real people being bombed out of their homes, people having nothing to eat. Now, as we speak, there are young children with no shoes, and I mentioned this in our previous interview. They have no shoes in winter time, but there are Shia who wear shoes worth over $1,000. People that I will tell you their names after, who are pro-revolution. So that's the reality on the ground. Meaning it's an emotive point, but it's the reality on the ground. People who romanticize revolution, like these guys who may use a Khattab picture in their profile, as if they even lived 5% of Khattab's life, and they may live here in the West, a peaceful life, and they promote revolution in Damascus, not looking at the fact that people will be imprisoned, They may go into prison for years until their death. Some of them will be maimed, some of them will be killed. And that's the sad reality. Their families fall apart. People are scattered across the globe.
I ask you again, what help and khidmah can the West, Muslims in the West do for their brothers and sisters who choose to rise up against brutal regimes as a part of their axis of resistance to dhulm?
Those who romanticize revolution, should talk to people who have lived in war and who have suffered from the after effects of those wars. It's nothing that you should romanticize. The Syrian revolution was not a revolution. It was, as I said, an Arab winter. The country was destroyed. I did mention that Bashar was a brutal dictator, but everyone has some good points. There was law and order in the country. There was law and order. This is generally interpreted, by the way, as being pro-Assadist. I'm not a pro-Assadist. I'm just saying this as a reality. I don't like Assad. I was questioned by his secret police numerous times. I even went to the place in Kafr Susay, which is where they would question people, and they were very harsh secret police. But in that country, prices were cheap. You could buy food. You could buy your daily groceries with £1. Yes? There was safety. You could walk up and down Damascus at night and no one would rob you. It was safer than Birmingham. It was safer than London. It was safer than any other country I have been to. Damascus was a safe city. And why don't people mention this? Even Syrians, the Syrians who are emotional regarding this.
Would you want Saudis to overthrow the MBS?
No.
Would you want Emiratis to overthrow MBZ?
No.
But these are regimes that many would agree need.
Again, so that shows I'm not biased. MBS is a Wahhabi, but I don't want him overthrown because it would cause bloodshed in Makkah and Medina. But it's not from the Madkhali standpoint of view. Where do I depart from Madkhalis? You can criticize these leaders if you want. Criticize them as much as you want.
You don't think that's bid'ah?
No, not at all. But similarly, if you just mention Damascus, why don't people mention the fact that the masajid in Damascus, was there a single, apart from the Sayyida Zainab Masjid, there were two shrines that Bashar had allowed the Iranian ministries to govern. Aside from those two shrines, all the Sunni shrines, including the grave of Muawiyah radiallahu anh, were preserved. Including the mosques, they were all Sunni. The imams were all Sunni. There was no imposition of Shiaism. That's propaganda. So I know when I see propaganda. So I've made it clear he was a dhalim. But there was no interference in the religious faith of the Syrian people. So when the revolution started, the Wahhabi groups, they put out the propaganda that Bashar is imposing Shiaism on the people. That was propaganda. There was no imposition of Shiaism on the people. The people were left to whatever religion or whatever sect they may belong to, as long
as they did uphold the regime.
As long as they do not interfere in the politics of the regime. But that doesn't make me an Assadist. So what people do now, so Galloway, you asked about Galloway. I've not listened to Galloway. I only know of Galloway from his performance in the Senate over 20 years ago. But, meaning Galloway's position on Syria. But it is very clear that there is a level of propaganda also. So when people point out that propaganda, and you have to be truthful. So the regime, yes, it's a despotic regime, no doubt. It was sectarian in the sense that the higher echelons of the mukhabarat were all from particular sects. In that sense, it was sectarian. But there was no, what were the lesser points? There was no imposition of Shiaism on the people. That's false propaganda. The mosques were left, the imams were all Sunnis. In fact, I would tell people that this is the only city I have been to that I do not need to worry when I go to the masjid, is the imam a Shia or a Wahhabi? Because I know he's a Sunni. Yes, that was the only city I have been to like that. Jerusalem may be another city. If you don't go to but that's because the Palestinians are 99% Shafi'i Sunni. So that was the culture of Damascus. So you have to point out the good things, that there was peace and safety. Now look at the state of the country. We cannot even travel to Damascus. The north is war-torn. Idlib is under siege. The Syrians are displaced. The country has been emptied of Syrians that Germany all of a sudden, Germany, a country, by the way, that recently has made a law that you must accept Zionism you must accept the state of Israel. Yes, they've allowed so many million or hundreds of thousands of Syrians. Is that because of their generosity? Or is it because Zionists want Syria to be in the state? Those Syrians in a generation or two will refer to themselves as Germans. And Syria will be emptied of Syrians. Is that a part of the long-term Zionist plan? These are the questions that need to be asked.
I'm glad that we can kind of wrap up on Syria because it leads to a very important concluding point, and that's sectarianism, right? We have intra-Sunni sectarianism, and it's been further exacerbated in the absence of a khilafah. Not to say that it didn't exist. We absolutely know sectarianism exists. Intra-Sunni sectarianism existed during the peak of Islamic civilization. So we're not saying that, it is something that's new, but it's been certainly exacerbated also because there's so many competing Islamic movements and groups who ultimately want the same thing, and that is iqamuddin. They want to see a return of a civilizational rise of the Muslim world, something that the Ummah enjoyed for over 1,000 years, good, bad, or ugly. We have intra-Sunni sectarianism, Sufi, Salafi, Ash'ari, Athari, Wahhabi, Ikhwani, Hizbi, Deobandi. Then we have the Shia, the Rafida, this, that. Where does sectarianism play in imperialism and the axis of resistance? I ask you this because Indian intelligence services have been very open that they use sectarianism between Barelvis and Deobandis to keep Pakistan busy on sectarian issues. We also know that Indian intelligence services back certain groups to cause domestic acts of terrorism in Pakistan and elsewhere. We know that the American intelligence services uses sectarianism and exacerbates it to keep the Muslims busy. But I would also go as far as to say that we would be naive and dishonest to say that schisms and sectarianism doesn't exist. I'd be lying if I sat here and said to you that there isn't a historic distrust towards the Shia. If you look at certain historical events, whether it's the sacking of Baghdad or the Fatimiyya, or how certain Shia groups historically supported the colonialists, right? Where does sectarianism fall in the story of imperialism and axis of resistance? Specifically the Sunni and Shia issue.
The Sunni and Shia thing. Firstly, we are now at the pending invasion of South Lebanon. There's a pending invasion of South Lebanon by the Israeli forces. You have Hezbollah stationed there. If someone goes to South Lebanon, they will tell you, you look around, you can't see any fighters.
Yes, I've been there.
Suddenly what will happen? You'll hear firing from the ground to air missiles coming up from points where you do not recognize where those Hezbollah fighters are. Hundreds of Hezbollah fighters have died and will die for the Palestinian cause. But they are...
Is it for the Palestinian cause?
But they are Shia, yes.
But is it for the Palestinian cause? Are they dying? Are Hezbollah fighters dying for the Palestinian cause?
That would have to be asked from the Hezbollah fighters, meaning you can't judge their intentions, yes? But there is a distinction between culturally Lebanese Shia and Iranian Shia or Iraqi Shia or Pakistani Shia. They all differ. Yeah. They are very different. So when you meet Lebanese, they have the baggage of being Lebanese. Mm-hmm. They are Arab. Mm-hmm. They have the same language and the same ethnicity as Palestinians. So there is a nationalistic aspect to it also. But in this current conflict, we also have the Houthis in Yemen, the Zaydis, undermining the ships that go to Israel, come from Israel. Is it wise for us to enter sectarian differences with those two particular groups? The answer is there is no theological discussion that's brought up in the first place. Meaning, in the current context, there is no theological discussion. The theological discussion is with the 12th Imam, with the Sunni Shaykh on theological issues. But when you have a common political objective, there is no problem with Sunnis and Shia or Sunnis and other groups uniting on a common political objective. The short answer to your question is, our theological debates will always remain. We will always debate, but never allow those theological debates to undermine our political objectives, especially in the case of removing imperialism, and in this case, the current occupation, the Israeli occupation of Palestine.
We've spoken about this in detail, and I know it's an issue that frustrates us both. I know it's an issue that frustrates the vast majority of the Muslim Ummah. Even if they don't say it, they don't voice it. Why does it seem that the Shia world is so better organized politically? Let's put aside the different entities and state actors and non-state actors, but in terms of as a collective, the Shia crescent, as they call it, they seem far more organized, focused on what their objectives are. Why is that significantly lacking in the Muslim majority world, in the Sunni Muslim majority world? In fact, you find the opposite. You'll find the regimes and the governments of Sunni majority nations part of the pawns of this imperialistic system. In fact, they are doing anything but resisting. Why is it that they appear to be far well more organized, but the Sunni Muslim world is in tatters in terms of its leadership, in terms of its collaboration, in terms of its khiyana, its treachery, in terms of these regimes, these Sunni governments? I'm not talking about the people. Alhamdulillah, the Ummah, their ghairah, their feelings, their sentiments, I would confidently say is more or less on the same page. But why is it that the leadership and the regimes and the governance of the Sunni world, they vary from cowardice to treachery?
And the short answer to your question is leadership. So post 79, with Khomeini's leadership in Iran, that changed the face of Shiaism. There was no such type of leadership in Shiaism prior to the Iranian Revolution. So go pre-79, you had King Faisal taking a stance on the oil in 1973, even though afterwards he contributed billions towards the British economy for some strange reason. But he did take a stance on the oil in 1973. That was some type of leadership skills. Bhutto was with him, but again, Bhutto was then sentenced to death by General Zia. Then you had General Zia's alignment with the United States. But the short answer is leadership. So from Khomeini's leadership, you've had a reform of Shiaism, of political Shiaism. And then that spilled out into the region. So if you remember the sufferings that the Lebanese went through when the Israelis invaded Lebanon in the 1980s, the militias that carried out a slaughter of Arab Palestinians and Lebanese people. And then after that, the Shia, they learned from that experience in the 1980s. It led to the formation of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah was Iranian-backed. So this means that leadership is what carries out an effective change on the ground. So as long as there is no leadership in the Sunni Muslim world, there will be no effective political change. So the leadership can come from any nation, but it needs that right leadership. So they had Khomeini is the short answer.
So given that your most recent book, The Intellectual Intifada, right, and obviously you've written books and one of the areas of expertise is the caliphate, and we've had an hour and a half and we've discussed Syria, Arab Spring. So how is it that we didn't attain this leadership? How do the Muslim Ummah, irrespective of where they are, Arabs and non-Arabs, East and West, how do they attain to seek this leadership?
The purpose of the
Without revolution, without an armed insurrection, without seeking the help of Western powers, how is it that you suggest?
So the purpose of writing the book and naming the book Intellectual Intifada was changing mindsets. For instance, many years ago in Blackburn, how many of you would have envisaged a Sunni Imam sitting on the stage with Dilly Hussain discussing this subject? Would you have envisaged that? No. They never discussed these type of things 20 years ago. What would they do? They would tell you, vote Labour. Just vote Labour. Even when Jack Straw was MP for this constituency, post the Iraq war, but now you have a change of mindset. And that is what the intellectual intifada entails. Changing the mindsets of the people, the new leadership, the future leaders, the young children here. These are the future leadership of their communities. So we need a global change, and we live in the age of a global internet with global communication. There was someone I knew, I needed some books from Damascus. He contacted a person in Damascus. They had first-hand contact. He went to local bookshops, showed him on camera, these are the books available. He's communicating first-hand with someone in Damascus. Who would have thought of that 20, 30 years ago? So we live in a global village, and that global village requires an intellectual intifada. And the intellectual intifada is something that should spread like a virus in the minds, that the mindset needs to change en masse, that we need to see what were we governed by for 1,200 years, more than 1,200 years. What were we governed by? Why was it such a stable system, if you can call it a system, in comparison to what we have today? Why was it suitable to our needs? That is the khilafah. And that is what young Muslims need to understand in terms of, especially in the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world, where we are burgeoning populations of young Muslims. So like Pakistan, Bangladesh alone have a high proportion of young men and women, younger people. They need to understand that Islam is the alternative for their situation in that region. So that is actually the alternative for us.
Final question. And I know this is something you wanted a bit more time on, but I'm just going to put it out there. Conspiracy theories and prophecies. Allow me to just ask you that one last question. I recently had a guest on. You made a reaction response video to it. He was an interesting elderly preacher, very well known for his takes, especially to do with the end of times. I just want to wrap up today's conversation because it's to do with imperialism and it's to do with axis of resistance. And that is the Muslim Ummah's relationship with Russia and Orthodox Christians in general. What should the approach of Muslims be when it comes to Russia, Putin's Russia, and what should their position be with regards to those prophecies that say there will be those from amongst the Romans who will join the ranks of the Muslims? Last question to you.
With regard to that, as I mentioned to you, Gamal Abdel Nasser, imagine me and you were living in 1954. And in 1954, you see Israel, it was 1954, wasn't it, when they attacked when they attacked Egypt? Was it Suez Canal?
54, 56.
1954. We're living in that time. France, Britain, and Israel decide to invade the Suez. 56. We back Gamal Abdel Nasser. Does that now mean that we approve of everything relating to Gamal Abdel Nasser? The answer is no. Similarly, if you have a Putin in Russia and he carries out a policy like he condemns the burning of the Quran, and we praise that particular stance, it doesn't mean we approve of what he may have done in Chechnya and what he did do in Chechnya and Dagestan. It doesn't mean that. So if you have that nuanced approach with every leader, so for instance, sometimes I may praise Erdogan in the context that Erdogan is the better alternative to other political leaders for Turkey, in Turkey.
And then blast him elsewhere.
And then I mentioned criticism with regard to his stance on NATO. It doesn't mean I've aligned myself with, and this is the stance we should have regarding all the leaders. That doesn't mean you align with everything any government may do. So our stance on Putin is very nuanced. If we praise Putin on a particular thing, it doesn't mean you approve of other things. Same with China, the same with Britain. The same with Britain. There were people here who supported COVID. Does that mean that they agree with this Trotskyite atheism? The answer is no. The same with people who here love King Charles. Does that mean they love Charles the way he treated Princess Diana? The answer is no. So that should be our stance. And I would think that's a given, meaning people should understand that. While Shaykh Asrar Hussain, the conspiracy theorist you mentioned, he has a blind approach towards supporting Russia blindly, supporting China blindly, supporting whoever you may support blindly. That's never been the stance of any intelligent person, and it should never be the stance towards anyone.
Is there any concluding comments you want to add, Sheikh?
Concluding comments, inshallah, is do not vote Labour. Have some shame with regard to Labour, and Keir Starmer is a clear racist, so Zionist. So avoid Labour and choose a right candidate, inshallah.
Brothers and sisters and friends and allies, I hope you all enjoyed today's discussion. If there's any shortcomings from our part, forgive us for the sake of Allah. I hope they met your expectations to the event that was initially planned. And if it wasn't, then